Welcome back on the show, Matty Lansdown. How are you, mate?
Anthony Harcher. How you doing, mate? It's good to be here.
It's fantastic, and it's been a little while since you're last on the show, which I had a look up, and it was back on episode 48, where we spoke about intermittent fasting. We touched on game changers, we touched on plant-based diets, and it was such a great chat and just great feedback from that episode. So hence, you're back on the show, and we're keen to do some more chatting about particularly this new emerging, I don't know if it's emerging, but it's taken off, is this plant-based phenomena, dieting all around. You go to the supermarkets, you see it. You go to buy some meat, and you've got this whole section of meat-free products and, vegan-friendly on labels. And so really keen to pick your brains, Matt. And this will be titled Plant-Based Diets, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So they're the points I want to hit.
Super juicy. Yeah, I'm keen. Yeah, we were just checking before. The last time we connected, it was only a year ago we hit record, but it feels like with the last year, it feels like 5 years ago. So I'm glad we're back here.
Oh, absolutely. No, it does. That time lapses. It's just incredible how long it feels. So just on plant-based diets, Matt, I'm really keen to get the science as to whether we are designed to eat plant only, and is that really, really good for us? What is good about it? Obviously, there's always good about any diet you're on. There's always a good aspect to it.
For sure.
So let's start with the good.
Yeah, totally. Well, the good thing about plant-based diets fundamentally is obviously eating plants is not a bad thing. Getting more things that grew in the ground into your body is a really good starting place. But I think as well, like chemotherapy is plant-based, right? And I wouldn't really encourage healthy people to put that in their body. So we have to be super aware of where real food starts and ends and where marketing starts and ends. And so just the phrase plant-based is, or even vegan, and it's the same in all diets. Like even now, like the ketogenic diet, the word keto has been stolen by the marketing industry. There's all of these things that are actually not keto at all that are quote unquote keto friendly. And it's the same with these plant-based diets, is that we've got this belief that's being perpetuated through society that plants are the healthiest thing that you can put in your body. And now that's up for debate, of course. But by default, then something that is plant-based must be healthy. And there's an incorrect assumption that goes from plants actually being healthy versus something plant-based being healthy. Hence the chemotherapy example, which is the most, extreme example, but it's the same for anything in a bag, a box, or a can that you can buy in a supermarket that's processed, that's got, one part of the food pulled out, heavily concentrated, the other supporting nutrients removed. And then we have the conversation as well as, at what point is it no longer plant-based? Is it when there's just one plant ingredient in there and the rest are all chemicals that were made in a factory with artificial sweeteners and artificial flavor enhancers and emulsifiers? That piece of food could still be quote unquote vegan or plant-based, and a lot of people will pick it up because they think it's the healthier alternative. And now we also see fast food outlets getting on this same marketing bandwagon, and they're not doing it. I mean, it's a twofold thing, right? On the front end of the business, for all of these products, fast food or supermarket, wherever it is, when we see plant-based or vegan, they're obviously trying to speak to your belief that you feel one of two things. It's either healthier for you as a human or healthier for the planet. And it could well be both of those things, but that's the thing they're trying to speak to you with on the front end of the conversation. Because as consumers, that's generally the two biggest concerns we've got. How's it going to affect me? And if I'm, somebody that believes in caring for my environment, how's it going to affect the world that I live in? On the back end, however, companies are jumping on board because it saves them money. It saves them a lot of money. It's about 10 times cheaper to produce carbohydrate-rich foods as it does protein-rich foods. And protein-rich foods are often animal-based products, your meats, your fish, that type of thing. And they're animals that you need to keep alive and feed and nourish. And so, on the back end, it becomes a conversation that's actually about economics. And that's the unfortunate truth of the capitalist world, food world that we live in. And so it's just playing on these beliefs that we have, that things that are plants must be healthy. But the question is plant-based healthy? Well, if you're just eating the plant, that's pretty healthy. That's the good thing, is that, eating more plants, more vegetables, having a variety of colors, getting the polyphenols, the antioxidants, that is great. That is the great part of veganism. That's the great part of plant-based. However, we end up with this situation where there's a lot of other stuff in the mix, and we just put the bit of celery on the packet, or we put the tomato on the packet, and don't see the back end of the conversation.
Yeah, so what you're saying, that real ugly side of this industry is the marketing component and the drive for making more money, essentially, by using these labels and grabbing the attention of that consumer that may be a bit ignorant as to what else is in that product, which, as you said, could be just all chemical rubbish, and they've just got one ingredient that enables them to put in or to label it as plant-based. So, thanks for sharing that, Matty. Now, you've just come off a 5-week carnivore diet, right? So we're talking, this trend is plant-based, and, everyone's jumping on this bandwagon, whilst Matty, in the meantime, is jumping on this carnivore. Tell us about it, please.
Yeah, sure. So I guess first up, as a nutritionist, I just like to know what's out there, I went vegan for a few months, many years back. I want to try all of these diets, because I want to know how it feels. How is it to do? How accessible are these foods? Is it easy to whip up recipes? Whether it be carnivore, whether it be vegan, whether it be pescatarian, so I've tried a lot of the diets, and January was World Carnivore Month. And we know, for the nutritionists particularly, and functional doctors and stuff, we know that carnivore diet's becoming a real therapeutic tool that a lot of people are finding really works, not just for weight loss, but particularly in autoimmune disease issues, eczema, a lot of these long-term standing issues people have been fighting with for many years, are discovering that carnivore is the thing that cleans them up. And so I thought, yeah, it's World Carnivore Month. I've got a lot of people around me talking about it. I know a bunch of people that do it. So I was like, I've got to give it a go, and I think the other thing is that, with any diet, whether it be carnivore, whether it be vegan, is that the issue we've got in the modern world is that we no longer really follow actual deities. We use our diet as the deity that we follow. And it's like, I'm vegan because of the belief systems, when really we should be eating whatever food we eat because it makes the human body the best that it can be, irrelevant of the label that we put on it, right? And labels are useful because it draws boundaries as to what may be healthy and what is not healthy. But I think, when we live our lives by these belief systems that this diet, runs their lives by, then we're fallen into a sticky situation where we're sacrificing our health for the belief systems of the group. So anyway, I was like, I want to give this carnivore diet a go and see how it feels, see how my body responds. And it was pretty predictable, and by predictable, I mean that, in the first couple of weeks, bowel movements were a bit out the window because the gut is adjusting to this, new diet with a single food group, basically. And so I expected that the first couple of weeks, my bowel movements would be a bit all over the place and I'd be adjusting. And then after about 2 weeks, it went back to basically totally normal. And for anybody that knows the Bristol chart, it was back to a 4. I was back in the middle. And I was actually, even though I knew what other people had experienced, I was pretty shocked when that happened. I was actually like, because that really challenges our belief systems on the purpose of fiber. And, we're told, all these different things about we need fiber in order to have a healthy stool and make sure that the bowel movements are regular and that they're soft and you don't have to push and get hemorrhoids and that kind of thing. And so, and with all the other truth rabbit holes that I've been down in the world of food and medicine, when it came to the idea that we need fiber, I was already ready to be like, all right, do we really need fiber? All right, let's find out. Let's do a carnivore diet. And so it turns out that stools went back to normal, which was super interesting and kind of unexpected. And so I got to the end of the month, and I think the thing that I enjoyed about it was just the absolute clarity. Like a lot of other diets, you're in the supermarket, you're flipping over, packaging and being like, can I eat this? Oh, maybe I can. And there's all this food because it's so processed and it's got a bit of plant this and it's got a bit of animal product that. A lot of people spend time being like, I don't even know if I can eat this. And I actually really loved it wasn't a gray line. It was a really big, thick red line that was like, this is what you eat. This is what you don't eat. And it was just so easy. Like, there was no mental calories that went into like, can I eat this or can I not eat this? So I felt pretty good. My energy levels were good. Once my gut adjusted and adapted over that 2 weeks, I felt great. And fair to say as well, and acknowledge that I did feel great before on my sort of regular omnivore diet. So it just took 2 weeks of adaptation, and then I was kind of back to normal.
Wow. So just explain what you ate on a typical day on the carnivore diet.
So the funny thing is that my normal diet isn't that far removed from carnivore. I don't really put a label on it myself. I don't make any attempts to stick to a certain diet, but it sort of generally falls into the keto carnivore. I eat a lot of high fat type things. And so on a normal day, and this is a normal day now, is usually the first meal of the day for me is like mince. It's usually beef mince, usually flavored with spices. I usually also chop up liver, it'll be lamb liver or beef liver. Now there's about a 9 to 1 or 10 to 1 ratio of how much goes in, because liver can be quite an uncomfortable flavor for many people, me included. So I make sure that there's a little bit of really finely diced liver in there for real high nutritional value, because I really believe that liver is one of the most nutritionally dense things that we can consume as humans. And you can actually supplement it now too. They do dehydrated versions of it. So it'd be mince with liver. Salt would go on there to flavor it, or it might be some herbs and spices. And then that would usually last me until the evening, and then it might be bacon and eggs, or it might be a steak, or a steak with an egg on top type thing. So it was a lot of that, and then we just cycle through the meats. It'd be like there'd be pork, there'd be lamb, there'd be beef, there'd be kangaroo. A lot of these types of things, venison as well, just cycle through these foods. And because we're eating protein, and obviously fat comes alongside with a lot of that stuff, it's incredibly satiating. It's really filling, and when you kind of full for a number of hours, so it was really easy to not snack, which I found really challenging on vegan and vegetarian diets. Whilst you would fill up on your vegetables, because they're so easy for the gut to break down in comparison, you would feel hungry again sooner, and so you'd be looking for that satiation again. So yeah, it was just lots of steak and bacon and eggs, and it was delicious.
Wow, it's it's really interesting, given where society's going and what you're sharing with us in terms of the science and the research around the benefits of a carnivore diet, and and your experience being on a carnivore diet, because a lot of people will say, if they go plant-based, they feel exactly like you've felt on a carnivore diet. So it's really interesting hearing this. So what's your regular day like now? So you're back as an omnivore. What do you eat on a regular day?
Yeah, so beef, mince, and liver is almost always part of the first meal, except I usually got avocado in there, maybe some cherry tomatoes, because I really just love a hit of that flavor of cherry tomatoes. And I'm lucky too. My parents, we in the country and got lots of vegetables and fruit trees and stuff. So I like to get some of their food in, because it's just so flavor rich. But it's still mainly that kind of ketogenic, high fat scenario. And then sauerkraut. Sauerkraut is or kimchi are regular parts of my meals for the probiotic. And keeping in mind, 5 weeks on a carnivore diet is not a long time as well. And that's one of the issues with most nutritional research, is that it's not done for long enough, and it's not tracked strictly enough in order to be able to really pull strong conclusions. So it's funny when people throw around like vegan's the best or carnivore's the best, and it's like, show me a study that was done that actually concludes that, because it was like, oh, we put people on this diet for 3 weeks, or, we checked in with this group of people across 10 years and we're relying solely on their memory, which is a really unreliable way to collect data, So So 5 weeks is not a long time. But yeah, normally I have just more, a few more vegetables, some asparagus, some broccolini, tomatoes, that type of thing. But the big thing that I always prioritize plant-wise is fermented foods. And that's, your probiotics, your kimchi, your sauerkraut type foods. And that's just for good gut population, keep the digestion moving. And actually, after coming off the carnivore, I felt that maybe the optimal scenario, and this is untested, but would be carnivore plus sauerkraut. I reckon that would be like the perfect combo if you were going to go down that path.
Is that your next diet? Is that the next thing you got to trial?
Well, I actually kind of did it for another couple of weeks, just adding that in, just that extra gut support. Because obviously the risk of going down to a single food group in any direction, vegan or carnivore or anything in between, is that your gut population will begin to diminish, except for that what it needs for that group of food, which is why people that have been on a standard Australian diet or lots of fast food, sometimes they have healthy food, they have plants, and they get this bloating or this constipation or this pain. And that's a combination of a gut acidity issue, but also that they haven't cultivated the species that are able to support the breakdown of that food. And that's why a lot of people are like, I tried to go healthy and I felt worse. And that's just like the 2 weeks that I went carnivore, like we've got an adaptation phase. So I think, bringing in that sauerkraut to keep the populations flowing for areas that it might not be being fed by the diet because we've restricted it to a single food group. Now, I don't think, carnivore is the answer forever. There's definitely lifelong carnivores out there. But I think from the very limited research we have and my general knowledge about immune system and diversity of gut microbiome populations, I think omnivore is still the sweet spot for overall human health. But we're also in a world of people that are overweight, sick, dying. And so sometimes we need these extreme diets as a therapeutic response.
In terms of creating that positive change, because that's what I'm hearing, like around any of these diets that you've mentioned and the studies that you've talked about, is that they've run for a relatively short period of time, but because people are just focused in that short period of time and very compliant, and they're therefore taking out all the rubbish they generally add in, and they're just eating what's part of that diet. So they're generally eating quite clean foods, and that's giving them a good result.
Well, that's what you're referring to is what they call the honeymoon period, right? It's that any diet you go on, basically, you'll feel great for a honeymoon period. And so that might be the first month or the first year or the first 2 years until the nutritional deficiencies of that diet catch up with you. Because the human body's amazing. Like we can, find ways to collect resources and rebuild nutrients in different ways and go without nutrients for a long period of time before we actually start seeing, some physical symptoms or consequences of that. And I think that when people can't see the problem right in front of them, that they're like, I feel amazing right now, which is great. And sometimes maybe doing a month of vegan or a month of carnivore here and there throughout, your year or your life might be a good detox. Do you know what I mean? It might be a good strategy to just dip your toes in the water of feeling great. And I think, it's easy to get lost though. And I've actually interviewed a few ex-vegans on my podcast that were vegan for, up to 10 years before they really had to turn around and be like, I'm having symptoms of deficiencies as a result of my dietary choices. And one of the people that I talked to was a nutritionist. And she said she was so attached to the belief systems that she was embarrassed to come out and admit this, that even with all the supplements and even with all her knowledge, she herself couldn't even keep up with that problem. And that's not something that I'm yet to see, and it's still early days, but in the carnivore space, because a lot of those common deficiencies that pop up on a plant-based diet are usually because of the absence of animal food. So I'm yet to see serious deficiencies in the carnivore space. However, again, I would still advocate for a general omnivore diet, whether that be, keto or whether that be high carb or whatever that looks like.
And you touched on a really good point there in terms of when you did it, you were eating a wide variety of meats, right? And I can see this is where some people could go seriously wrong if they just say, carnivore diet, Matty Lansdown did it, he got great results, I'm going to do the carnivore diet. And they don't do it the way you did around this wide variety, and you explained obviously the nutrient density of the liver, for example, and there's stored vitamins in the liver.
Totally.
And like you look at some of these, indigenous cultures such as the Inuits, they only ate animals, right? But because they ate the whole animal, they were healthy.
Oh, totally. And that's a really good point, is that we're in this weird phase of like social evolution that it's really disgusting to think about the organs of eating the organs of an animal. And granted, some of them don't taste great, but it's just like anything. When we were kids, or anybody that's a parent knows that it takes like 20, 30, 40, 50 attempts to get their child to eat something that tastes a certain way or feels a certain way. And it's the same for us as adults. We're just big kids, right? It's like, yeah, we try a bit of liver the first time. We're like, disgusting, never going to eat it again. That's the exact same thing your 3-year-old did, And so when you go back, your palate will slowly change. It will mature. And the weird thing is too, if you think about like an animal, and if we talk, maybe some of this taps into some of that vegan ideology when it comes to the wellness of animals, is that if we're going to take the life of an animal, we want to get the most out of it. Like we want to transfer all of the nutrition and energy that animal had into us, right? And we'll give that back to the earth in different ways, because we'll go to the toilet, and feces and manure grows plants, and there's a whole life cycle conversation there. But the point is that your organs are far more complex, and the animal's organs are far more complex than your muscles, right? The work that your liver has to do versus your bicep is like 100-fold more, right? And by default, it's the same in animals. So when you've got a far more complex part of the body, its nutritional density is far higher because it needs more resources and tools to achieve all of these molecularly complex tasks. And so it's weird that we're in this world where it's like, health's really important, and you and I are having these conversations on this podcast, and still we go to the supermarket and the only thing available is almost the least nutritious part of the animal, which is the muscle meat. Now, if you think of it economically, it's like, okay, a cow has one liver and it's got the muscle to feed, 10 families, So you can, again, it's back to where we started with that, like health versus economic conversation, is that, yeah, you can get some nutrition from a steak, and that's great. They taste delicious. But if we're talking health, then the organs have so much more value, and they often get put into dog food. They get put into the food industry in different ways, and their resources are used. But if you go to your local butcher or anything like that, or the market, you'll be able to get organs super cheap, and it's the healthiest thing you can feed your family. You can hide it in different things very easily. And actually, it used to be back in tribal days, and they even do this in the animal world, is that when there's a hunt, is the head elder or the woman that was trying to conceive would get the liver. And even now, wolves, like when they go and hunt, the head of the wolf pack gets the liver. And that, like, many species know that is the most nutritionally dense part of the animal. And that doesn't restrict us to just liver either. Like, we've got heart, we've got the brains, we've got stomachs. And particularly in Hawaii, they used to have a tradition that was the two top hunters. They'd get the kill back to camp. Because a lot of people say on a carnivore diet, which is why I mentioned sauerkraut, where do you get the probiotics? Where do you populate your gut? Now, if we go back to traditional eating, they used to get the kill back to camp in Hawaii, and probably in lots of cultures, and there was a competition. So the two hunters would get on either end of the intestines, hands tied behind their back, and like Lady and the Tramp with the piece of pasta, it would be the first person to eat their way to the middle. And their palates were conditioned for that, and they were consuming the guts, like probably little pieces of feces and all of these colonies of bacteria from an animal that was often eating plants. And so the human gut then by default gets all of these populations. So that's why I think in the modern world where we don't have great amounts of access to organs, that a good way to do that combo would be the carnivore plus sauerkraut. I reckon that's hacking the system.
I love it, Matt. It's a new diet.
I reckon it is.
It's the new Matty Lansdown trend. So, yeah, you touched on that real ugly piece of, plant-based in terms of the longevity, and that's when the problems start to encounter with people. And I guess the longevity is influenced by it becoming a habit. And you mentioned before the identity, people associating themselves around the label, such as I'm a vegan, and they attach themselves to that identity. And so therefore it can become long lasting, and it's not just a 5-week trendy thing to do. Yeah. So what should these people look out for in terms of these, doing it for longer periods of time around nutritional deficiencies?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think plant-based specifically is, first place you have to start is, do I have a deficiency of knowledge? Because a lot of these things are predicated on beliefs. I was told by somebody I look up to that this is the way the world works. And if I've learnt anything, I'm not super old, but if I've learnt anything, if I look 5 years ago, there's heaps of stuff about nutrition I no longer believe, or I believe differently. And I think it's we should, whether it be carnivore, whether it be vegan, whatever your belief system is, I think starting with do I have a deficiency of knowledge, or am I inflexible to alternate opinions and ways of looking at things? Because a lot of people that have chosen to be vegan or vegetarian do it for animal rights. And I would argue that if you look into that beyond the marketing and advertising on the front end of the propaganda, is that you will learn a lot about the complexity of the food system. And I think this is one issue too. And I know, Anthony, you and I have both gone to university and actually studied. We're not just another health coach on the internet. And what I mean by that is not that they don't have value to add, but anyone that's done an actual degree studied food policy and food systems and food security. And when you actually know how the world of the economic world of food works, you start to really see there's some deep problems. And so when you've got somebody who doesn't understand that piece, it's nice to be idealistic on the front end, to be we could all just live in this happy place where we just buy supplements because we're wealthy enough to buy supplements. But it causes lots of issues on the back end, an entire planet that is monocropped kills loads of animals because we've got to clear natural habitats, and we've got to kill spiders and bugs with, and rats and bunnies and stuff and where does that conversation end? Where is sentience no longer worth? When is a spider sentient enough to not kill? Is a cow sentient enough? It's a deep rabbit hole. So I'd start with deficiency of knowledge, which if you're listening to this, you're obviously in the right place. But when we get to nutrition, the obvious one's B12, right? And do you see that too in your clinic?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And iron always pops up. Protein is another one. So, yeah, because some of these people are wanting to do veganism or plant-based, but they also want to do it low carb. And as you mentioned at the start of the episode, that doesn't go hand in hand. It's very hard to do plant-based low carb, hard. Right?
Oh, so hard. It's it's a mostly carbohydrate diet.
Yeah. So, that definitely B12. And
B12. And the other thing too with things like B12 is that, if we think about, if we do take that, health of the planet idea that a lot of the vegan propaganda talks about, is that if we have to supplement something, we have to have resources for that. So we're just taking our attention away from the food industry resource, and we're just giving, more power to the supplement and pharmaceutical companies. And that just means they take over the world and the planet in a different way. So it's not there's not an answer that is just good. There's always pros and cons, right? And then we've got to go to, and the other thing to consider is, if you have to supplement, it's not a natural diet. We are animals, and yes, we've got these amazing brains, and we know how to socialize and consider questions like, what is the meaning of life? Which, is probably more burdensome than anything. But because we've got that capacity, it leaves us in this situation where we can make moral decisions. But the moral decision becomes am I sacrificing the health of my own vessel for the consideration of a species that would never consider keeping me alive for a second? If I was, in front of them in the jungle, it would just take me out, no question answered. And so we've got this kind of moral conundrum, and some people feel differently. Maybe they'd be happy to give their lives to a bear if it was in front of them. I don't know. I wouldn't be. I'm not down with that. But then it's the other thing too to supplements is that a lot of the time these are synthetic analogs. And so an analog is it's a similarly shaped molecule that is not exactly the same. So they slot into these receptor sites and sometimes don't even get absorbed. Sometimes sometimes send incorrect messages, and sometimes they just sit in the blood. So you can go get your vitamin D, for instance, tested with your doctor, and you've got low vitamin D. You go to the chemist, get a cheap vitamin D tablet. One, it's an analog. Two, you're deficient in vitamin K2, maybe calcium as well. So the absorption of that vitamin D doesn't happen. However, a few months later, you go get your blood tested, and the doctor says, oh, you've got plenty of vitamin D. Because it's hanging out in your blood. It's not being absorbed because these are synthetic versions of the real thing. So even though, possibly you can supplement your way out of problems, I think that in many instances, doing supplementation for a long time is a secondary, or should be a secondary option quality-wise to getting the real thing. From plants, from animal products, from the sun, but, getting the real thing. So B12 is really big there because it's like almost 100% of vegans need to be on a B12 supplement. And yes, you can get it from artificially cultivated plant sources, or sources that we debate are plant or not plant, which is like algae. It falls into that window of like, is it alive? Is it not alive? Conversation. But obviously, vegans prefer to think of it as a plant. So you can obviously get it from there. But then same thing. We just move away from eating animal products to creating massive spaces where on the earth we have to monocrop algae in order to produce, the health benefits from that. Now, I'm not saying that that's not a useful thing. I think chlorella and spirulina are brilliant tools nutritionally. But if we're going to use that as a sole source of B12, then we're in a sticky situation.
Yeah, I loved how you started with, questioning the belief systems of someone, and you then, talked about your journey about, what you believed around nutrition 5 years ago. And through your quest and thirst and hunger for knowledge in this area, you've obviously moved on. What are some of those things that 5 years ago that you totally believed that you now have totally debunked? I'm just interested.
Yeah, totally. Well, I definitely thought that we should have most of the diet from plants. I tried vegan to give it a go, but I was very much of the opinion that plants were super important, but I never was fully convinced we could get all the protein we needed from plants, and especially because if you're eating whole real food, as you mentioned before, one of the deficiencies on a plant-based diet outside of B12, iron, calcium, that type of thing, is often protein. Like, those are micronutrients. Protein is a macro, and as much as yes, you can get protein from plants. There's no debate there. You need 750 grams of quinoa just to get enough protein in a single meal. That's almost a kilogram of quinoa. So, high standard or high protein on a vegan diet is usually really high carbohydrates. And so you're in this situation where maybe you're not losing weight. Maybe you can even get pre-diabetic symptoms because you're eating, so many grains. So it's like a sticky situation. So for me, I definitely thought like, oh, maybe we should be like 80% plants and, a little bit of meat or a little bit of fish. But yeah, now I definitely think that probably prioritizing protein should come first. So when you're building your plate, I think putting protein on first, and ideally that should be an animal source because it's more well-rounded. It's always going to have the essential and non-essential amino acids in it. You don't have to do maths before you do breakfast because you're like, am I getting all of the things, today? Which brings up another point about sustainability. If you have to be putting all of your stuff into an app every single day, whether it be calories, whether it be nutrition, to be like, am I getting this? And most people abandon that really rapidly because it's arduous and painful. And then 5 years later, they've got a deficiency because they weren't tracking it. You don't want to have to do that. So start with building your plate with a healthy dose of protein, and then move to your other macros, your healthy fats, your carbohydrates, all of which are great. But yeah, isolating that to one is a bad idea, I think, when you're trying to find protein in a inherently protein deficient diet is challenging. So that's what's changed for me in a big way, is like, I don't think we need as many plants as I used to think.
And you just touched on another popular topic at the moment, which is protein in itself. And high protein diets are trending as well. And that's primarily probably around weight loss. And as you mentioned earlier, giving that satiety, so you end up consuming less calories throughout the day. Yeah. How much protein? That's the because these high protein diets are pretty much all focused and oriented around the protein. How much are you recommending?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think as well, we talked about the honeymoon period of diets. We also have to acknowledge in this industry as professionals, we also have a honeymoon period with new fads because it's like the new science and then all the good science is coming out. Then again, we start to get the longer term studies and it's like, oh, every diet ends up in the same place, basically. So important to acknowledge that there is a metabolic pathway for turning amino acids into body fat. So you can overeat protein to the point that you cause, more fat gain, basically. It's much harder and it's much less preferential than the pathway for carbohydrates, but it is possible. So you can overeat your way into, carnivore fat gains, basically. It's just challenging. So for me, what I see, and I don't know how you feel about this, I'd be interested to learn, but from what I've seen is that we can digest and absorb about 30 grams of protein per meal. And as you absorb it, it usually pans out to about 10 grams per hour after the meal. And if it's any slower than that, then a lot of that stuff will be excreted, or depending if you did significantly overeat, it might be, go down into fat stores. But I'd say about somewhere between 25 and 40 grams, depending on the person, the height, the weight, the gender. But about 30 would be the sweet spot, and a lot of people get these numbers mixed up. They're like a 30-gram piece of steak. And it's like, no, that should be about a 200-gram piece of steak, right? Or a 140-gram piece of chicken, basically. And, because it's made up of different components, the body will pull out about 30 grams. So is that where you sit, about 30 grams per meal?
Yeah, and you mentioned that bracket 20 to 40, and I have heard the extreme case up to 50, but obviously very dependent on the individual. So
yeah, of course,
yeah.
So, but the other thing that comes up too is that a lot of people say, and this is often one of the vegan arguments against carnivore, is that your kidneys will undergo duress or collapse, or you'll have kidney issues. And we're basically yet to see that because the kidneys do the filtering of excess protein. And unless you've already got a kidney issue, we're yet to see that in any data or research that I've seen. Even anecdotally, I haven't heard that. So it's an understandable thing to have in your hypothesis that due to increased protein, there may be kidney problems, but yet to see it from this end. What about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I haven't seen any literature that really, does indicate that. So, no, you're right on point, Matty. Certainly, in terms of my understanding, really appreciate you coming on the show again. It's been amazing chatting with you, and you've provided terrific insight. And what I love about your insight is it's so well-rounded. You bring in the economics of it and the consequences of monotyping crops and things like that. So, and belief systems is you always bring that mental component in and throw out those challenges to people in terms of challenging their belief system. Where does that come from? Have you learned to, have you started researching more about that to get a better understanding of how the food industry works? So, really appreciate the conversation, Matty. Now, how can listeners best connect with you?
Yeah, sure. So I've also got a podcast, which the wonderful Anthony Harcher has been on, episode 120, and that's called How to Not Get Sick and Die, so you can head over there. And I've also got a Facebook group for mothers, so it's called the Busy Mums Collective, for any mums wanting to get healthy, lose weight, manage their emotional eating. Awesome.
Beautiful, because busy mums certainly need that support. So great initiative, Matt. Fully endorse that. And please, I'll include those links to Matty's podcast as well as to his Facebook group in the show notes, so you can go directly there. And to the listeners, thank you for tuning in to another insightful episode of Me and My Health Stuff. Thanks, Matty.